this episode of the USA Carry podcast. This is your host, Sal. I'm solo today. We're going to deep dive a particular topic that is especially important to all of you concealed carriers in our contemporary society. We're going to discuss how the nature of the threat that we face has changed. And it has indeed changed in just the past several years. So let's discuss the criminal threat as it is historically within the United States. Now, the main reason we carry concealed handguns is to protect innocent life from nefarious criminal entities, of course, who would pose violent and deadly threats to ourselves or those that we love. Now, historically in the United States, we've had plenty of criminal activity at the street level. There's no denying that. So just a trip down memory lane for many of you, of course, are too young to even know the sort of time frame we're discussing here as far as firsthand experience, but let's take a history trip back several decades. The truth is, violent crime within the United States peaked in 1993. That was the highest single homicide rate. Now, throughout the 80s, it was relatively high. In certain parts of the 70s, it was quite high. It really started to uptick in the late 60s compared to anything previously in our nation's history. Now, even going beyond that in time, backwards in time, look at the Roaring 20s where we had gang violence, mob violence at a level that was unprecedented up until that point. You know, you had things happen like the St. Valentine's Day massacre in Chicago, of course, which was which was an impetus towards Congress passing the gun legislation that they passed at the time, which basically banned full auto machine guns. You know, and all that kind of ridiculous legislation that comes out of an era where politicians try to pass laws to curb violence that is the result from the degradation of society, essentially. And of course, all of that mob violence was derived from prohibition, so derived from legislation that they passed in the first place, right? So violent crime is nothing new. 1993, we have the peak of violent crime in this country as far as the recorded homicide rate. Now, there's a few factors, though, that I want you to consider when we think about that. So, are we actually living in a safer world or more dangerous? So, spoiler, it has become indeed statistically more dangerous in the past several years post-2020 compared to where it was. However, from 93 on, we had a significant drop in violent crime. But I want people to realize that statistics are not always an accurate portrayal of what's really happening in the real world. So, as an example, in the early 90s, compared to present day, or let's say compared to 2018, 2019, violent crime was far, far lower statistically compared to the early 90s. However, what is the other differences that are happening there? Well, one is the sheer fact that trauma care has improved immensely. You know, most modern emergency rooms, if they wheel you in and you have a pulse, you have over a 90% chance of leaving alive. So even the difference in medical technology, essentially, in the past 30 years, has made an enormous difference between how many attempted murders there are, how much attempted homicide there is, compared to how many people actually end up dead. So when we look at the homicide rate and say, oh, it's statistically much lower than it was in the in the early 90s, while that is true, it's not necessarily true that the amount of attempted homicide is that much lower, okay? Realistically, it probably is lower, or at least it was lower at the point of the 2018, 2019 than it was in the early 90s. Other reasons for the decrease in overall violent crime, there's cameras everywhere, right? In the past 20 years that has become a thing, whereas if you go back much further than that, there was simply less cameras looking at all public locations, essentially, right? And that is a great deterrence against crime. So, other things to consider: the tough on crime policies that came into, for example, into New York City under Mayor Giuliani. We had broken windows policy. So the idea of broken windows policing is that if you are arresting the low level criminal activity, jumping turnstiles and that sort of thing, well, you're putting thugs in jail, and then they're not committing more serious crime when you keep thugs in jail. So with the cultural and political movement that we've had now in the past decade in this country, as more and more big cities have turned away from proactive policing, and basically they hamstring their police in the name of whatever ridiculous, justice reform. The way you reform justice is to hold police to a higher level and higher standards, not to, cripple them from proactively policing, right? So we're really paying for that at this point. The deterrence against criminal activity is simply not there. So when we think about all of those things factored in, the truth is our statistically lower crime rates are probably not as much lower as we think they are compared to the early 90s. Now, starting in the summer of 2020 on, there is an absolute uptick in violent crime. In fact, the difference between 2020 and the summer of 2021, there was an actual murder increase of about 20%, which is historically the single greatest increase in any one year that we've ever seen. Now, it's ticked back down since, but it is still not back to the pre-COVID year, essentially, the pre-2020 rates that we had, which were essentially the lowest rates we've had in the United States since really the early 1960s. Okay, so I want to be careful and not alarmist when we discuss, are we indeed living in a more violent world than we once did? For example, if you're around my age or older, if you're a kid who grew up in the 80s, you may live under the assumption that it was a safer world. Well, the truth is there was far more child abduction in the 1980s than there is currently. Every year there were more cases of child abduction than there is in our contemporary United States. So even though it may have felt like a safer time, we didn't have the media that put all of this crime in our face. We weren't as aware of it. Okay, statistics show that that is not the case. We did not necessarily live in a safer world. Now, one of the reasons that child abduction is so much lower now than it was is that parents have become helicopter parents. Now, there's a lot of social downsides to that, right? Being too protective as a parent. A lot of people realize that. But that is also one of the reasons that there's simply not the opportunity for predators to pick up children. Also, again, everything is on video. Okay, so these things have changed things. So even though statistically there's less child abductions, that certainly doesn't mean that there's less sickos and scumbags who would like to grab a kid, right? So same rule applies for overall violent crime and homicide rates, okay? We have medical technology now that greatly skews on the side of survival after people get shot or stabbed in the street. So those things make a difference. So we won't be alarmist when we discuss what the changing nature of the threat we face is. With that said, I want people to realize that there is an undeniable increase in violent crime post-2020. Starting with the summer of 2020, there was a massive jump in violent crime compared to the years previous. And not only is it an increase in crime, but we're seeing crime the likes of which we have not seen before. And if you want to be prepared to face violence, the threat has changed. If you're still thinking the way we were thinking 10 years ago, you are out of date. Okay, we need to update our understanding of this threat and update our own tactics and lifestyle to deal with the new and emerging threats that we face. So, what are the issues that are different currently? Let's discuss some of the major threats that we face, either at a community level, a personal level, even at a national level that we currently face that are changing the nature of the threat of violent crime. The biggest one, hands down, is the movement to defund and really, again, hamstring the police. That's the biggest factor. There is no denying that. Now, as an example, a lot of large urban areas are currently running on skeleton crews because they have far less enlisted conscripted officers than they did prior to 2020. All of the good cops are getting out as quickly as possible. Early retirement is at all-time high. Recruitment is at all-time low. So that alone is a huge factor in why we have escalating crime. The sheer numbers that we need for patrol officers on the streets is not there. And who can blame them? Who would want that job currently where there's certain factions of our society who absolutely lash out at police even when they do the right thing? And they've done many bad things. Okay, for example, the big event in the summer of 2020, we had a bad cop do a bad thing. That bad cop went to prison for life. So what profession will we not find bad actors? Tell me. Look at the things that, the scandals that plague, priests in certain religions. Look at the scandals that plague any kind of, teaching, etc. Should we blame all teachers for the actions of a few bad ones, right? So it's a ridiculous thing. The entities, the social and political entities that push that movement to cripple our police forces want chaos to reign for political reasons. That's the impetus to that movement. Okay, so police are simply not being proactive either. So they're running on skeleton crews, and they're not being proactive because they do not want to put themselves in the position to take all of the heat when some, dirtbag police chief and dirtbag mayor wants to pile a politically charged incident that happens, wants to pile it all on the single officer, even if he did everything right. Okay, so we have a lack of proactive policing. Now, the vast majority of lower level, and not necessarily that low level, but the vast majority of lower level crimes are receiving no response in a lot of big urban areas. So as an example, just in the past few weeks of this recording, the city of Pittsburgh basically put out an announcement that they are not responding to anything, including burglaries during the daytime. So if there is no response to a crime, there is no record of that crime. So when you hear certain media outlets that play cover for the powers that be currently and saying, oh, why do Americans feel that crime is higher when really it's not? Well, part of the reason that statistically it's not that much higher is the vast majority of crimes are going unreported in big urban areas. So Americans feel that it's more violent out there on the streets because it is. Just because all of these crimes are not getting reported into the main FBI database and the other places that track these crime statistics annually doesn't mean that the crime is not happening. Okay? So the crippling of our law enforcement is absolutely the main reason this is happening. A very close second reason, and arguably this is just as consequential, is the fact that in a lot of large urban areas we have woke progressive prosecutors who are not prosecuting criminals. And it's that simple. And anybody who would refute that simply has not done any research. Okay, there is a particular billionaire in the United States that pumps enormous funding into the political races of prosecutors. And it's really an ingenious strategy that he has used, because what he has done is he's put in place these progressive prosecutors that are not prosecuting criminals in the name of social justice, and it's causing mass chaos. And what happens with mass chaos? Well, especially the demographics in urban areas, they don't decide to go arm themselves so they can protect themselves in their own communities. No, they call on the government to step in and protect them. Okay, so this is all by design. You have chaos that reigns, and it gives government more and more power. We might be heading for a push for a federalized police force. And you can accuse me of paranoia or conspiracy theory, etc., but watch over the next few years what may emerge here. There may be a push for a federal police force, since obviously local and jurisdictional police forces are not up to the task anymore due to all of these strategies that have been put into place. Okay, so we have prosecutors not prosecuting criminals. And this is all from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So if you live in a particular place where you have a good police force and a serious prosecutor who actually prosecutes criminals, your crime rate may indeed be no higher than it was pre, 2020. Okay, but if you're living in the notorious large urban areas, you indeed have a much higher violent crime rate. Okay, so some other things to consider that are changing the nature of the threat. It's not just that the threat is emboldened because they're essentially, criminal actors are above the law in a lot of places, essentially, but the threat itself is changing. So we've seen an enormous increase in mob violence consisting of multiple attackers. Think of the flash mobs that we've seen hit in big cities like San Francisco, etc., where, there's policies that essentially are not prosecuting lower level property theft. So we see these flash mobs emerge. A lot of times it's younger people who all just show up, by the dozens and smash out the glass and rob all of the valuables in big box stores, that sort of thing. Now, we've also seen an increase, though, in mob violence that gets violent and dangerous. We see an increase in multiple attackers involved in assaults on the street, an enormous increase in that. Okay, so that changes the paradigm of the threat that, as the armed citizen, you prepare for. So gone are the days when the first and foremost threat in your mind had to be the sole lone individual, the neighborhood crackhead who robs you in a parking lot or in an alley. Certainly that still exists, but that's not the only threat that needs to be on our radar. Okay? Multiple individuals attacking lone individuals who they deem vulnerable or just, catch by surprise, etc. We're seeing more and more of this. Okay? There is a definite increase in active shooter attacks. I like to call it active killer attacks because it's not always active shooting. We've seen vehicle attacks. We've seen attacks using explosives. We've seen edged weapons attacks, right? So mass killer attacks, there is no denying the extreme uptick in the number of mass killer attacks we're seeing in the past decade. And it has significantly escalated in the past several years as well. Now, bear in mind that the media that has a particular agenda, and their agenda is to ban your guns, okay, they inflate the numbers. So they take everything that's like a gang-on-gang shooting in the ghetto, where gangsters are shooting at each other. They consider that a mass shooting if a few thugs get hit. All right, similarly, they lump in the statistics of when a few thugs in the parking lot of a high school in urban areas get into a shooting, and it happens, on school grounds, even though it's between gangs and it's a war over drug turf or something like that. They lump that in with school shootings, etc. So they absolutely inflate the statistics. However, if we strip that away and look at the legitimate mass killer attacks, it has indeed increased. Now, statistically, it's still anomalous compared to more routine street-level crime, but we're at a tipping point where it really is something that needs to factor into the preparation of the average armed citizen. Okay, it may still be an anomalous event, but we just see too many anomalies for it to indeed be a black swan anymore, right? It's certainly not a black swan event. It's an event that happens repeatedly. Okay, so increase in the active killer paradigm. What that means is the increased likelihood of facing a threat that, rather than it being, an unhealthy, emaciated crackhead in the parking lot with, a stolen revolver in his hand, this may entail facing a threat that's wearing body armor and utilizing a rifle. Okay, we've seen that many times. So, can that be neutralized by the lone armed citizen with only a handgun? Absolutely. It's happened over and over and over again. There's been many incidents in which the armed self-defender, armed only with a carry handgun, has neutralized rifle wielding active killers. So it certainly can be done, but you want to think in terms of, how does that threat look different? It's very likely going to require an accuracy standard that's higher than the parking lot problem requires, right? We might be looking at taking headshots at more extended distances. So consider that, where are your accuracy standards currently? Does it need work? And what kind of weaponry are you carrying? I absolutely love small frame revolvers, and I carry one often, when I'm walking the dog in the neighborhood or whatever. But out in public with the family in the 21st century, I am a believer in a double stack autoloader. Okay, or even this new crop of small autos that give you a gun that's so small, but if you can shoot them well, you have a gun with significant capacity in it that can be shot well. So these are things to consider. The final issue that I will pose is the fact that there is growing hostility towards armed, legitimate, righteous self-defenders. And I'll give everybody a hint. This typically happens in the same urban environments that protect criminals. So the same prosecutors who will not prosecute repeat violent offenders will come down with the weight of the earth on the individual that dares protect themselves. So what does this mean? Well, the first thing you might say is, don't go to those places, but that, of course, is easier said than done, right? A lot of people live in these lousy urban progressive environments. A lot of people also have to spend time for business in those areas, etc. So if you're in one of those places where you may certainly have the legal right to be carrying, it's imperative that you avoid anything that can be avoided. You do not want to face the legal system in such a place. And if you do need to use force, you have to do everything right. Because if you have a prosecutor who's aggressive enough, who wants to make a point, right, who wants to prove a point at your expense, they will come after you no matter how righteous the use of force is. So ultimately, your fate may reside in the hands of a jury. Okay? So at that point, you want to make sure that everything was done right. All of the T's are crossed, all of the I's are dotted. Do you know the law that governs the use of force? And if your answer is, yeah, my cousin is a cop and he told me this and that, that is not the appropriate answer. Okay. The appropriate answer is that you've read Andrew Branca's book, The Law of Self-Defense, that you've read Massad Ayub's books on self-defense law, and the best answer is that you've trained with guys like that. Both of them teach classes where they teach nothing but the principles of self-defense law. And just like you routinely go to the range, which I hope you do, and routinely may be, once every several months for a lot of people. That's a lot better than not going. That puts you well ahead of the curve, I love to encourage people to do live fire training once a month if you can get to the range that often, at least once a month. And that's all great. But my point is, on some kind of regular basis, just like you should be practicing with your gun, you should be regularly educating yourself on the laws that govern self-defense. Okay, are you fully aware of the principles of ability, opportunity, and jeopardy that make up the principle of imminence when a threat is imminent? Do you know if you live in a stand your ground state or not? And regardless, I don't think it should change your actions very much. You should retreat anytime you are able to safely do so. Why would you stay in place and have to resort to force if you could simply and safely leave the area? Okay, so these are the kind of things you want to think about. Are you familiar with the use of proportional force? There's a big difference between simple assault and deadly assault, and less lethal tools to deal with simple assault, lethal tools to deal with deadly assault. You know these principles. You have to. If you are carrying a gun for self-defense, you absolutely have to understand these legal concepts so that you can protect yourself legally. All right. And going further with the legal discussion, if there has ever been a time where it is imperative to have legal coverage, it is now. I don't call it insurance because that's really not what it is. These groups, these agencies, some of them consist of basically organizations that pool money for the legal coverage and legal defense of somebody who's unfortunate enough to get prosecuted for a righteous use of force. Okay, you need to be part of one of these groups, and if you want to call it an insurance group, fine. But there's numerous ones out there. There's the Armed Citizens Legal Defense League, there's CCW Safe, U.S. Law Shield. There's a variety of them. Okay, do your research, see which plan is best for you, and have that coverage backing you. Now is the time, because if you do everything right, but you happen to do it in one of these jurisdictions that absolutely love their thugs, they love their criminals, repeat violent offenders are right back out on the street. They'll come down like a hammer on you, though, if you defend yourself against one of their beloved thugs. And again, that's not hyperbole. If you think that's hyperbole, you need to educate yourself. Stop watching CNN and listening to NPR and Fox and all this kind of mainstream stuff, and seek out the actual news of what's happening. All right? This is not hyperbole. This is an agenda that is in place. They want to dissuade individual self-defense, and they want to encourage criminality, and that's what the prosecutors in these places are doing. Okay? So you need to have the legal coverage on your side if you find yourself there. All right, because if it does end up going all the way to a jury, then that is an expensive, life-ruining event, and you want to have those resources behind you. Okay, some things to think about. So, other things that have changed on our landscape, even compared to a few years ago. We have a wide-open southern border. If you think that's not a problem, and legitimately people tell me they don't think it's a problem. I don't know what kind of sense of false security somebody can imbue themselves with to think that having 10 million illegal migrants cross into the country in just the past 4 years is sustainable. In fact, it may be higher than that. Okay. Now, obviously, there's the whole social and political and economic impact of that. How as a nation do you even absorb that? That's all people that our tax dollars are paying for, right? But even beyond that, what the scope of my discussion here is the criminal element. Now, the truth is the vast majority of these people coming in probably are legitimately just seeking a better life, right? And come to work, etc. And it's nothing new, illegal immigration. Back in the late 90s, when I was a strapping young lad working construction, those construction crews, I'd say 60% of those guys were illegal, and they were good workers, and they were relatively trustworthy people, and so we have a long history of illegal migrants doing work. But what we're seeing now, despite the fact that the vast majority of them, again, are probably just honest, hardworking people seeking to escape whatever hell they're coming from. The problem is, in these massive numbers we're dealing with, even if a very small minority is bad actors, and we know many of them are bad actors, okay, there's been many hits on the terror watch list for these guys coming in. Okay, this small minority of bad actors that are infiltrating this influx of people who are being allowed just to walk in, we're going to see the ramifications of that. Okay, there are terror cells in this country. There's no question about that. Another aftermath of, or really a developing problem that's coming in the wake of this mass illegal migration is gang activity. We're seeing gangs set up in big urban areas that are derived from Central Latin America. Think of MS-13. MS-13, though, has been in this country for decades now. Well, there's gangs worse than that are setting up shop. Okay, we have drug cartels setting up shop among the most vulnerable populations. For example, they're taking hold in Native American reservations, that sort of thing. Okay, so we're facing something that we have not faced before. Again, I want the armed citizen to realize that the day and age of just worrying about the neighborhood crackhead putting a stolen revolver in your face and demanding your wallet, while that is still a viable and constant potential threat, that is, the tip of the iceberg as far as things we need to be concerned with now. So the nature of the threat has absolutely changed. The increase in the threat has absolutely changed. Do not be deceived by the media telling you that even though Americans feel that crime is higher, it's actually lower. The vast majority of crime is not being reported, okay, because there's no police response to it. So, for example, if you have a burglary at your house and you're living in Pittsburgh, well, nobody's responding to that. So there's going to be no report of that, okay? When a body assumes room temperature and they actually come and carry that body away, there will be a report of that. But it seems that short of a body assuming room temperature, things are not getting reported. So while the homicide rate may not seem to be that high, it may still be lower than the early 90s. That does not mean that there are not plenty of dirtbags out there looking to assault people and committing assaults. Again, think back to what we discussed with the increase in medical capability, keeping people alive. Okay, that has dramatically skewed the statistics. If we look at the rate of actual assaults, it's very high right now. Okay, it's very high. So I don't want people to think that the world has completely changed. Those of us who were children of the 80s and 90s, oh, things were so great back then and they're so dangerous now. That's not the case. The world's always been dangerous. There was a brief period in this nation's history, and that was really the post-World War II era, where, violent crime was statistically negligible. But that was coming out of the prosperity that the Second World War brought to our society. And things rapidly changed after that, So we grew up in a dangerous time, but unfortunately we now reside in a time that is more dangerous than ever. And it is not only the danger of the changing criminal entity, the changing criminal threat, but the changing political climate that we now face, where there is factions of this country that are absolutely rabidly hostile towards your ability to protect yourself. Okay? There's a political party in this country, one of the two major political parties, that as soon as they take power anywhere, and I've seen this in the state where I reside, they have a whole litany of gun control they try to pass to criminalize the law-abiding citizen, and not one of their proposals would impact violent criminals at all. None. Okay? And simultaneously, true story, said party, when they tried to pass all of this gun control, assault weapons bans, making it a felony to own magazines that have more than 10 rounds, they also simultaneously tried to pass reform of justice reform that would let repeat violent offenders out, or reduce, their crimes for assault and battery to misdemeanors, etc. So they want to empower the criminal, yet strip the rights of the law-abiding citizen from them. And you need to wake up if you think what I'm saying is, again, hyperbole. Just do the research. Look at the bills that are proposed in these places. Okay, look at the statistics of what happens as soon as all of these gun control efforts, etc., they take effect. Do we see a decrease in violent crime? Do your research and find out. Okay, so we face a political entity that wants to strip us of our ability to protect ourselves as they simultaneously release the worst of the worst onto the streets. And that's the reality we now face. So regardless of whether the amount of cold bodies that get reported in are higher or lower now than they were in the early 90s, the climate that we face, the environment we face, is much scarier. Okay? So this is depressing stuff to discuss. This is, not pleasant, but this is reality. This is where we are. And if you carry a gun to protect yourself, you need to understand the nature of the world around you. It is different now than it was. Okay? It's different now than it was in 2019. It's very different, completely different than it was in 2019. All right. So be carrying the lethal weaponry that you need to protect yourself and those that you love. Be carrying less lethal weaponry. Know the legalities that govern the use of force. You have to know that, and you have to have a command of that legal knowledge. Just like you should have a command of using your handgun, you should have a command of understanding the legal principles that govern your right to defend yourself and when it's appropriate to do so, when it's legal to do so. Okay, it's not that complicated. A lot of it is common sense, but sense is anything but common this day and age, right? So you need to educate yourself in the laws of self-defense. That is absolutely imperative. And be aware of your surroundings. I understand that there is an argument that says, well, if we stop living our lives, the bad guys have already won, right? If we stop going to concerts and the county fair, etc., well, the terrorists have already won. The street thugs have already won if we stop going to the cities to go shopping, etc. Well, it's not the terrorists and street thugs that are really pulling off that victory. It's the political entity that is making all of this happen. Okay, so while I agree that we can't let them win and we have to continue living our life, I would submit that if you have a family, then the safety of your loved ones is of paramount concern. I cannot even relate to the desire to go and walk around in Manhattan with my family. I'm much more inclined to do stuff by myself, because realistically, even when I have to go to, these horrible, places that strip me of my right to be armed, by myself, I'm fairly fleet of foot. I can probably get away from most bad things that may happen. Having children in tow, I hesitate to say, oh, just live your life or they've already won. Your foremost priority has to be the safety of your loved ones. So we're just living in a time where spending a lot of your time at big crowded events in big urban areas that lean blue politically, that is where the bad things happen. That is where the criminal element is emboldened and above the law. And find better things to do. Find better things to do with the family. Stay safe. Be aware of your surroundings. Avoid the places that are the most likely hot spots. We think a lot in terms of big events like a terrorist attack, active killer attacks, etc. Well, it's not always that. I mean, look at the things that happened, for example, just right after the Super Bowl this year. There was that big party for the Chiefs, I believe, and there was a shooting right there in the middle of a crowd, and wasn't really targeting anyone specific. It was, again, dirtbags shooting at each other, and you end up with a bunch of people hit. Okay, when you're in large crowds, this is a potential threat. The large crowd itself is a threat. So just be careful. I'm not telling you to stop living life, but be aware of what's around you everywhere you go. Have that safety plan with your family. Have a plan for what do we do if violence erupts or any other kind of emergency. Where do we meet? Is it somewhere in the venue? It probably should be somewhere outside of the venue, right? Have a link-up plan for if people get separated, etc. Know what you will do if violence kicks off in the environment that you are. Be aware of all the usual stuff. Who's there and what are they doing? Where are your exits, etc.? So all of that is in play. But certainly a greater element in our current situation is a situational awareness beyond just the awareness of what's happening at the particular location you are. Do your research before you travel to any given vicinity. Know what's happening there. Are you going to LA or Chicago or New York anytime soon? Do you know what is taking place? For example, if you're going to New York currently, don't use the subway. Have you seen what's going on? They have National Guard in the subways to contain the craziness and the lawlessness. Are you even aware of that? I find most people are not aware of that at all. They are not aware of how our reality has changed. Oh yeah, New York, that sounds great. Let's go, visit, the Empire State Building and all of that. And that's fine. But do you realize what's happening? It's not the same New York as it was in 2019. It's not. All right. Know where all of these homeless encampments have been set up. These migrant encampments that are being set up in all of these large urban areas. Know where they are, know what's going on. Again, probably the majority of people even in these places are harmless, but there's always that criminal element within. Homeless people, the vast majority of homeless in this country are victims, not victimizers. The vast majority are victims. Many of them are victims of mental illness. Most of them are harmless. They get victimized by criminals at a staggeringly high rate. But with people on the street, unhoused people, there is still that percentage, and it's small, but there's that percentage of very violent actors, a lot of them very mentally unstable, and unfortunately, a lot of our large cities now are absolutely filled with homeless encampments. So be aware of where these places are. Know the locations in any given city that should be avoided. All right. We live in a very different time. So the world has always been violent. For those of us, again, if you're my age or older, certainly you grew up in the 90s, the 80s, the 70s. The world was different. Okay, it was still violent, and there were certain forms of crime that were even higher than they are today. But it's the changing nature of the threat we must understand, and we must adapt our mindset and training for it. Okay? So, I'm Sal with USA Carry. There's some things for you to think about. Until next time, everybody stay safe, and we'll be back with you again next week.